get it right in some kind of rather generic way, and a model where you had a mixture of cities of various sizes and rural things of other sizes and travel between them, and might well be sufficient. But then if you go into, say, interventions and you have local lockdowns, then you need to, you may be looking at a subset of that model, but so, I mean, maybe the way to think of it is that there are sort of, think of lots of parameters as being more like sort of refinement of a small number of parameters. See what I mean? You have perhaps if you're looking at the thing globally, you can get away with 2 or 3 sort of network parameters that say what kind of network you've got, but you may find yourself later in the position where you need to estimate what those are like within localities and so on. But the other thing I wanted to mention, though, is that thinking of preparing for future pandemics, there's a whole question of what forms of transmission are possible for your future pandemic. I mean, we've already seen with COVID, I suppose, that although it's respiratory disease, and so it's fairly similar to flu, it's not quite the same. But of course, if you had something like HIV, then you've got you may need data that you can simply ignore when thinking of a respiratory disease, and vice versa. The building models, you need to say that there are various sort of methods of transmission, shall we call them, which we can put down as being. You imagine a table of kinds of diseases, and then the various modes of transmission that are important for each of them. I mean, Ebola would be another example of one that was different. So I understand that a lot of that was touch. I mean, it wasn't airborne, but you got that by touching the dead bodies, and so that was why the funerals were absolutely devastating for spreading the disease, because having some kind of contact with a dead body was absolutely lethal. I imagine somewhere there's someone must have drawn up tables of sort of forms of transmission for different kinds of disease, but whether they've all been modelled much is another question.
Well, I suspect if you go back to the Anderson May Bible, a lot of the basics would be in there. I mean, it would be deterministic, but as far as modes of transmission and so on are concerned, there'd probably be some there. But
yes, probably.
I think the point is that there's, you could do a lot of preparatory thinking about, you could follow through these kind of ideas like uncertainty quantification, etc., for different types of pandemic that you might anticipate, and learn what kind of things you might do for each type, and they might be different, as Dennis says. But yeah. I mean, I guess the point is that in reality, the whatever new pandemic there is, will in some sense blindside us. But
absolutely, and I think what's needed is and UQ is probably a good framework for thinking about this. There's that need to be open-minded. If you get something and it looks as though it's another respiratory disease, then in the first instance, you would grab your best coronavirus model from 2020 and start looking at that. But as you do that, you should be instead of, I think there is still a mindset of a lot of people will be, well, we'll just fit that. It's the nearest we'll get. We'll just fit that. Whereas what you should be doing is saying, as we go, okay, let's fit it. But as we do that, let's test it as far as we can to see whether its patterns of transmission are coming out the same or whether there are any differences. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think for me, one of the things that, at least maybe this is just my deficiency, but I think there's a need for better kind of diagnostic tools for epidemic models, so that we when you're fitting it, you then kind of spot, okay, this part is going wrong. You know, there's something about this that isn't right, and that becomes more routine, at least.
I think that's an important point, and that's one where we were blindsided with this. We didn't have the tools to do the things we wanted to do, so we spent all summer writing code that we should have had before. It should have been in the locker. That we should have had a toolbox that we could have very quickly done the things that needed to be done, and hopefully some sort of standards about models that you could apply those tools. That again, you didn't have to write vast amounts of code to actually be able to read different people's formats and such, which an awful lot of time was spent doing that. So you could make comparisons. So you could run sensitivity analyses or whatever.
Is the problem partly that government planning on this tends to like the idea of there being one good model, whereas in the situation of uncertainty, you might well do better to have half a dozen different models you throw at your new disease, to see what they make of it, and to see if one or more of them catch things that the others don't.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there's a big argument about that in climate, and has been for the last 10, 15 years. Some people pushing for a single global model that runs on the biggest computer in the world and has everything. And other people like me arguing, no, what you want is a variety of different types of model, because we know no model's right. So we've got a better chance if we have a spread of models. And there's a lot of tension, certainly in climate, about that, about whether you should build the model or we should have lots of people building lots of models of different complexities and different formulations, and you get a spread, but that spread is telling you something about the state of knowledge.
Yeah.
But you also need, to me, to build a model without knowing what purpose it's for seems very odd. And in the climate sense, they really want a sort of all singing, all dancing model that'll be available to answer any question that somebody might think of in the future. And that means that you end up with these horrendously complex models, which you may well not need for many of the purposes.
No, I agree with that. And I've had those arguments with climate people as well.
Me too.
That if you're interested in hydrology, why don't we just have a model that does hydrology? And they said, no, you have to model everything. But yes, and I think, I mean, the pandemic's a good example, I think, where we don't need to model everything. We do just need to model things because we want to answer questions. And we want to answer questions quite quickly. I think in climate, the questions are quite easy. You know, we need to cut emissions, and that's an obvious answer to the question. How much you want to cut emissions? Okay, that's a second order question. But here it's not. I think the questions are very, is this policy better than that policy? And that's a much more difficult question than should we just cut emissions or not, which is what climate models have tended to be for, rather than how we cut emissions.
But that sort of brings it seems to be, that's very much a place for the expert elicitation end of things to, you know, is this model better than, sorry, is this policy, this strategy better than that strategy? And so, you know, you can evaluate that question using a lot of different models and try to combine the answers from that in some way.
Yeah, I think that,
and the whole business of using the expert elicitation framework for the comparison and combination of different models.
Yeah.
I was very interested because David Spiegelhalter gave a as he always would, a very good lecture the other day, and he's got this slide where he shows confidence intervals or intervals, whatever they were, for R, essentially based on the same data but different models. And some are wide and some are narrow, but there's a tremendous amount of non-overlap. So quite clearly, anybody who's stuck with one model there is very likely to be getting it wrong and getting the uncertainty completely wrong. So we do need methods for combining and updating.
Yeah. I mean, if all the models point in the same way, then of course it's fairly, I mean, in terms of comparing interventions, that, you know, A is better than B, then presumably you can go along with A. But if some of them prefer A and some prefer B, then, you know, you're doing this. And that's where hopefully these sort of methods ought to be able to make some progress.
Yes. It's where did we get to yesterday? I think Danny was going to suggest, was it sort of 5 headings roughly?
She was going to produce a sort of set of bullet points or headings, whatever, yes.
And the idea was, and I think the idea was to have a structure that sort of corresponded to the kind of questions one had about inference and estimation in the early, middle, and later stages of a pandemic, and
Exactly.
so that one could naturally bring in, let's call them classical models and uncertainty quantification and expert judgment at the where they were most relevant, which seemed seemed an excellent structure for bringing us all together. The only problem is we haven't got it yet. So so what will be, so I suppose what we should regard, you should regard that as a little sort of rather unsatisfying trailer for coming shortly in your discussion group. Once we get that, we can ask people to flesh it out from their own points of view, and hopefully it'll take on sort of 3 dimensions as it gets inputs from different points of view.
Yes, well, while we're on that topic, the group who met yesterday did decide to have another meeting next week, well, essentially the same time, but 5 o'clock rather than 4 o'clock on the Thursday afternoon. That should appear somewhere and everybody should know about it, but it's worth flagging up now to those of you who weren't there at the end of yesterday, that most of the people who were, well, in principle, all the people who were there yesterday afternoon were saying that that would be a good time for them. Whether when it comes to it, they'll all be there, of course, is another matter, but one can but hope. But, you know, so if the rest of you were also able to do that.
I'm afraid I'm teaching again.
Oh dear. I hoped at the end of the afternoon it might be better, but...
I teach from 4:30 to 6:30.
I've got a clash. I don't think I can make it.
Right. Okay. Well, this will have to be done in bits, as we've found so far. It's really difficult. But at least, as Dennis was saying, if we've got some sort of stab at the beginnings of a framework from Danny and her team, that we can all start to add to.
I think as soon as we get that, if we do, I'll put it in the Dropbox folder and let everyone know it's there so that they can look at it and comment, add, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we can comment. We don't, even if we can't come to the meeting, we can comment on what's...
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
No, that would be good. And then we can try to decide whether, I mean, it did seem from the discussions yesterday as if the framework would be a way of bringing all the various sorts of aspects of estimation together. But we have to wait and see how well it works in practice. So, are there further things that we should try to discuss now? I mean, just based on the sort of thing we've been talking about already. Would it be helpful to flesh out any of this now? We're quite a small select group.
It might be better just to wait and see what the headings are and then contribute at that point, from my point of view. But
Yeah, I think there's.
I mean, we could do an equivalent thing from a UQ perspective, but I suspect that may just be duplicating work. And
Sorry, maybe what I missed what you said.
if you did a similar thing, but from a UQ perspective, as opposed from a estimation perspective, of how I would tackle that problem, or how Ian and I would tackle
Well,
that. But
if you,
I suspect that there's just going to be a lot of duplication, so I'm not sure it's worth it.
I think maybe see what she comes up with, and then see if you feel that makes sense. I mean, Ian was in the discussion yesterday and seemed to think that the framework that she was describing made a lot of sense and seemed quite
Yeah, that's fine then.
quite happy with that. So I think let's wait and see how it works and then see.
No, that's fine.
Because I think Ian thought that what she was describing really fitted very well with the sort of UQ approach anyway. So
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any point doing that in the parallel.
no, I think that's good. Okay.
I mean, the other thing people might like to look at is the current progress in the modelling group, which is the next door in the Dropbox CH06, where the latest thing there is the one begins CHP06 and is dated 13th November, which was the update from this morning's discussion there, because that's taking the same sort of roughly corresponding to stages sort of themes, and it's certainly got references to estimation prediction in it. So again, I don't think for the moment we should be worried if we're coming at the same points from from a slightly different angle, or but it's perhaps something to be aware of. I still think it probably makes sense to have a paper that is on modelling and one that's on estimation, but we should obviously be aware that each is going to cross-refer to the other. Glenn, do you want to add anything to that? Because it's Glenn's suggested structure where.
yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely some of the elements that are mentioned in there which kind of overlap with some of the UQ stuff in terms of, how, so the discussion we just had in terms of, how you present models to people who have to make decisions when there's multiple models, and how you represent uncertainty, and sort of, how you present the idea that the model has been validated in some sense, what's been done there. But I guess there's probably not enough space to go into as much detail as we want to in terms of the uncertainty quantification and estimation in this paper. And similarly with the estimation, there's stuff about, how we can sort of estimate in real time, which obviously there's a big overlap with, I guess, what Danny is thinking about. And there's also some of the other stuff that we mentioned at the beginning in terms of how you could use models to inform data collection, which again might overlap with stuff in the estimation and also the data paper. But in a way, I think that's all good. It's just what we need to do is find the sort of the relevant angle for each of the papers to draw out. So I think in that paper, in my mind, it's more about the model structure and the techniques used to represent certain features in the system more than the estimation side of things. But it's not 100% clear to me what that difference is. But
And I think we hope that this would all become clear as we there's Ian, just as we're thinking of stopping. Hi, Ian.
That's okay.
Ian.
Nothing personal here.
That is no problem.
Right. So basically, we have just been discussing where we got to at the end of yesterday's meeting, and the sort of format that Danny was proposing, which and was going to, you know, write some sort of outline, which we would then start to see how to put things into. And hopefully I relayed that you were, from a UQ perspective, you were reasonably happy with the sort of structure that she was suggesting. You thought that that would work.
Yes. Much of what she described. I mean, we think in similar ways. I think. I mean, Danny, as she said, she thinks in terms of posterior distribution. So she's a proper Bayesian at heart, in a sense. So many of the steps she laid out, Peter, for example, were pieces of our UQ framework. So I was relatively happy, and I will probably come along and try and push just a couple more pieces towards the end. But she had laid out most of the steps, so I was happy. It was cool. Obviously. So that seemed kind of okay. So I guess if we're just waiting for her to do that, I guess is that I guess that's the point. We best just to wait for her to get that down, and then
I think that's the tenor of what we've been saying. I've also was drawing people's attention to the latest on modelling from the modelling discussion this morning, which if you look in the next door Dropbox, the CH06 one, what you want is
CHP06 or something.
One begins CHP06, and what I'm actually thinking is that I'm going to there's two versions, which the one we want is the latest, which ends with 13 November. But I think what I'm going to do is grab the older one and stick it into the archive folder, which is what I'm trying to do. So there's now just one file in there called in the CH06 whose title begins CHP06. And that's the one that's what's come out of our discussions this morning. And what we went, and you'll see that's under 5 section headings. And what we ended up doing was assigning 2 or 3 people, I think the names are noted in the margin of that, to go ahead and make more of each of those sections. But if
you might want to look at that.
Yeah, I've just seen that now. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to confirm that I'm okay with that.
If you glance down that, you'll get an idea of how much the modelers are treading on the toes of the estimation people.
Except that I think I can't, for the life of me, find a piece of paper where I jotted this down this morning. But I think Glenn was involved in the data one, weren't you, Glenn? I mean, I think if I remember rightly, that your name was attached to 2 of the sections particularly, but
yeah, 2 or 3 even, I'm not sure, but yeah. I think the data one was one where
so I sorry, I don't mean, yes, the data one, but the estimation one was what I was actually both. So you provide a very good bridge between the modelling as it's currently progressing and the estimation over here, because you're sort of involved in estimation from both perspectives. So that would be, sorry, I said data by mistake, but confused things.
So which are the areas where there's an overlap? Which are the areas are they? I really don't mind if they step on our toes, as long as it's.
Well, I think it sort of runs a bit the way through the paper, but I mean, there's bits which talk about. I don't know if you've got it in front of you, but there's bits which talk about, doing real-time prediction to advise control, and then there's another bit. So that's probably the main one, and then there's a part which talks about using models to inform data collection, which obviously could involve estimation and like assessing how much information is available from different sorts of data. So that section itself could potentially switch over completely, in my mind. And then there's a final one which is a kind of about open science and open modeling, which again I think there's a lot of stuff in there which overlaps with some of the UQ stuff and sort of presentation of multiple models and thinking about model uncertainty as well. So potentially you could have sections on those in both, or it might be more sensible to put some of that in another one in the estimation paper. I'm not sure.
Well, I don't really mind. I guess my overriding feeling is that as long as these are covered somewhere, that's priority number one. It's just that they're talked about somewhere. I know Danny specifically said a few of those things you just said yesterday in a plan, right? So like evaluating which data you could collect to help inform your model or your predictions. We would go even further. That's a lovely area, which again might be slightly more in this sort of world. But I mean, I wouldn't really want to push it. If there's people there who are really kind of keen and got their teeth into something, that's cool.
Well, I think we actually came to the conclusion this morning that was an area where we probably had the least people. I mean, I think I agree with you. It's a really important area, but as I say, it might be better handled by. In fact, I think we did discuss the fact that we might need to bring some other people in to do that. So,
or move it across.
Or move it across, exactly. Yeah.
Bring people in or push it away. You have
But it's exact. I mean, these divisions were done, first up without really knowing how things were going to work out. And I think the main thing is that we cover everything, which is what you were saying, and exactly, and we managed to make some fairly sensible divisions so that we get some fairly coherent papers, collections of challenges out of this, and moving stuff around to enable that is fine.
And I think putting cross references in will make it actually better.
Yes.
Watertight compartments, which would not be, because if you're careful, you can get contradictions. We don't want contradictions.
Sure.
With the various challenge papers. So,
I think what we were thinking was that for many of these things which sort of overlap, that it might be more natural to, it might be that there are different aspects and you want it discussed in both in some detail, but it might be that it could, that it's sufficient to develop in one place with a cross-reference from the other, just to say, this is a modelling thing, but we're going to talk about it in estimation, or conversely, whatever. So.
It always depends how what is the remit of your modeling. So of course, because the word modeling, of course, can just be made bigger and bigger and bigger. and if you say your model is your full statistical model framework, the framework I was bang on about in UQ, then of course, then that subsumes a lot of what we're doing. But for a lot of epidemiologists, when they say modeling, they don't mean that. They mean epidemiological modeling. Trying to model the disease progression with a very cunning model.
More the mechanistic aspects of
that's it. So that is a kind of natural line to draw, but only if people in that group were kind of happy with that line. So then when you talk about things a bit beyond modeling, such as data collection in the real world, which data do you collect to inform your model better, that's now stepping more into our camp. So that's just a possible way one could draw a line. I wouldn't want to kind of insist on it because there's no real strict lines here. It's all a bit blurred, but it's interesting. Yeah. The other aspect, of course, is that again, I'm sorry, I always sound like a broken record, but we always talk about this sort of embedding things in this overarching framework, and the problem with the course of slicing up papers into sort of subcomponents of the problem is that sometimes you miss the overarching view, the kind of what is the sort of sensible framework in which we are all operating in, because no paper actually has that overarching status. So that's the only thing which kind of makes me pause. But again, I don't want to push this too strongly because, we should just do something which works, and the practicalities of getting these papers out.
The two tables which are in the top level of the IDP Dropbox are supposed to help us keep a hold on the bigger picture and how all these things relate.
Yes, but it's more about it's not just about the organizational structure of what the papers are doing. It's about our concerns that there is sort of missing research about the structure of how one uses complex models to predict reality. So I'm not talking about a sort of organizational level. I'm more talking about, we think there is a hole here. And when we talk about challenges paper, this is the sort of perfect candidate for a challenge, which is to put it succinctly, epidemiology is a very important science in its own right, but the use of complex models and their relationship to reality is another kind of sort of science in its own right, one could say, and we feel there's parts of that missing from current practice. So
I wonder if
perhaps each of the challenge papers should have a last challenge, which is a complete blank page headed unknown unknowns, which the reader is allowed to fill in, is invited to fill in for themselves. You know, what have we failed? What have we just, you know, it'll actually have one sentence. What have we failed to spot?
But I think
But it'll be, but you know, but I quite like the idea actually of somewhere, maybe we wouldn't get away with one in each section, but to have one page in the whole volume that was blank on that way.
well,
Yeah, I like that idea.
We could ask if we could finish with a blank page. You know, we've done our best to look at all the challenges, but I'm sure we've missed something important.
Yeah,
But I think Ian raises an important point that decision making under uncertainty using complex numerical models is not unique to epidemiology. And the relationship between whatever the science of making decision making under uncertainty using complex models is called, there is a relationship between epidemiology and that science, and that might be different for different things, for climate or environmental, air pollution or whatever, but there are commonalities, and there is sort of epidemiology in that sense fits in a bigger picture. And I think we should have somewhere in these challenges that bigger picture is probably the big challenge for some of these questions. Now, it's not the question. Modeling epidemics is a thing for epidemiologists to do, but this bigger picture is a problem for other people to do, and it's not internal to epidemiology. And I think I've not expressed that terribly well.
Well, is that maybe covered by, I mean, that's one of the things we attempted to do with the lecture series, was to finish up with some reference to other challenges like climate change and whatever, and with the question of, is the kind of framework that will help us plan better for and cope better with future pandemics similar to these other frameworks, which I'm sure the answer brought in some way, many ways is yes, but also in what ways is it different? I mean, one of the good things in terms of planning for the future is that the pandemic is so much more in your face, you have to deal with it now, than climate change or biodiversity challenges, which are much more the traditional boiling the frog sort of problem. And so an obvious positive spin-off from the present crisis is to ask, how do we make ourselves deal with, how do we stop people putting off challenges which they can manage to put off? You know, dealing with climate change, you can just about always get away with, well, we won't do anything this year, we'll deal with that one next year, whereas with the pandemic you plainly can't. So can we learn from that to deal better with these problems where it's not even clear? You know, in a way they've got the opposite problem. With the pandemic, I think one of the things we should be trying to say is, if we look closely at what happened in the early months, from when, you know, say roughly December last year through till March, in retrospect, we would be in so much better position if we'd done things quicker. Some of that, of course, was lack of understanding which had to come, but quite a lot was a bit sort of putting heads in the sand, saying, we'd really rather leave dealing with that till next month. We'd really, I mean, a government will often think it's not a big problem at the moment. It might be a big problem in a month or two. Well, we'll deal with it in a month or two, and that doesn't really work for pandemics. And
You raised many very good points there, and the interaction with climate is very interesting. But this is what we mean by there's this gap in the current analysis. So everything you've said there fits very nicely in an overarching sort of decision structure in which you have information and models that are advising you now, but governments are tempted to leave things later.
Yeah. I hope, I hope that gets covered in at the moment. The place covering that is the last challenge, the one called policy and politics, where.
Yeah, but this is again the where we'd say the gap is, because from our point of view, we see a huge amount of effort from a lot of very smart people, epidemiologists, building structured models. But these are just models, and then they go to inform policy about the real world. And of course, the politicians have a very hard time, and we should be critical of them, but also we should appreciate that they have a hard decision to make, which is they're balancing economic factors as well as lives today and all that sort of stuff. But the models they get are just, they get the top 4 or 5 models from SPI-M results put in front of them. And then Ronnie is doing a very good task trying to combine those in some sensible way. But this is a gap, right? This is a gap because these models are different from reality in a way which is not really talked about. And it is definitely not put into the rigorous form that we would want to, which is to turn it into probability distributions, to turn it into, there's a distinction between model and reality.
And I think one of the things it would be really nice to say something about with an attempt to influencing it for the better is the reaction between governments and scientists, where, well, the soundbite is to say that, where you're supposed to get science-based policy, you tend to get policy-based science, and and the scientists, we are at fault, or some of us are at fault, because I think you see this most acutely when you just occasionally being told by people on SAGE or SPI-M, this is the question we've been asked to address this week. And they're not allowed to say, that's a stupid question. It is not the question you should be addressing this week. They have to go away and try and answer it. And although the politicians may genuinely not mean to be doing this, that is one of the ways in which you get policy-based science. They force the scientists to answer a silly question, and they come up with advice which doesn't address the problems that should be being addressed. And unpicking that and trying to ask how that happens and whether there's anything you can do that will make it happen less is a challenge.
This is true. This is true. Again, that is a good point, and there are clear sort of issues there. Although, again, I feel they come more from the policy side. It's the speed and the lack of readiness. Related to your earlier point about if we'd just been a bit faster, and this is disconcerting. But on our side, on the science side, there's still this weakness. Like we produce projections from models. And so a very clean way to look at it is to just look at the recent projections from the top 5 modeling groups in the UK. And you just see if those projections agree, and they don't. Yeah. And then you ask the question, well, why don't they agree? These are really good groups. These are really smart people using top of the line data, recent mobile phone data and everything. And they've got predictions that don't agree. And the normal analysis of models and uncertainties and calibration models and incorporating data and doing inference and doing prediction doesn't quite get at this question of why those models don't agree. What we will say, of course, is, well, they're a bit different. They've been calibrated a bit differently. Maybe they've used slightly different data. But what's the next sentence beyond that? The next sentence is normally a bit of a shrug. And then we put people like Ronnie in a very difficult position, which is, here's 5 models, 5 uncertainties. Please do something with those. And now she's doing a great job, but she does not have the information, the proper information to be able to combine these beyond a sort of superficial level. which I very much liked her talk during the summer. I don't know if you saw it, but she was very candid about this situation. She said, you know, we are super rushed. So I've combined these 5 predictions in a very sort of simple way because we have no time.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about challenges for the next pandemic, surely a huge thing is to say, well, what would Ronnie do if she had a lot more time? What would she do if she had a year lead up time before this happened? Well, she would ask those modeling groups for a hell of a lot more detail about why their models are disagreeing. And this is the model discrepancy we talk about. So everything you say, Dennis, I totally agree with. These are all important issues, but I would keep bringing us back to the fact that there is this gap. People use models, they then talk about reality. There is a difference, which is people shy away from it because it is all the things that are not in your model. So we love to write down terms to express that. And we explicitly mathematically have a term which says all the unknown unknowns, as you mentioned before, are in this term. All the known unknowns, things you're not sure about, but you know of their existence, are in this term. And the key question is can you say anything about those at all? And if you can't say anything about those, then people should not use your model. Because if you come with a model and you say, yeah, sure, there's stuff which is missing from it, I just don't know how big that is. Well, then, you know, excuse me, I don't really want to use your model. Thank you very much. And of course, most modelers to start with will say, well, there's stuff in there that I don't know. And then you say, I don't want to use your model. And then they say, well, actually, I can tell you there is stuff in there, but it's only going to kick it by 5%. And there's a bit more there. That could be 2%. And this one's highly unlikely, but it would kick it by 10%. Then you start getting somewhere. And then you start getting, then you elevate a model projection, which is a kind of hands-off. My model's just saying this, you know, it's based on assumptions and I don't really want to, you know, trust that, to a model prediction, which is when you suddenly start to say, look, my model said this, I'm giving extra uncertainty because of these unknown unknowns. And I think actually for reality to be outside that interval, I'd be very surprised. And I'm going to put my, you know, my house, I'm going to bet my house on that interval. And this elevates complex model usage from the slightly hazy, if one were to be picky, slightly irresponsible usage that we see in many sciences, to a level of, well, I'm going to give a prediction now that I think I can back up and I'd be willing to bet money on, or what everyone cares about, not necessarily money. Now that's my rant over. My apologies for going on too long, but we often talk about this kind of framework as if it's you know, this wonderful thing, but that's the difference. It elevates model projections to model predictions, and it's a big difference. And I feel it's a worrying kind of gap as to where we are right now.
But it brings the expert elicitation back in, because that discrepancy is a final expert elicitation of what's wrong with my model, or we could even have a committee that looks and says what's wrong with everybody's model. That might be a bit controversial, but there is that extra bit at the end, as Ian says, that and I think people go astray when they put too much faith in the model, and they know the model isn't right, but they still, because it's a million lines of code and it takes 2 hours on a computer, it gets a, oh, what's the right word? An authority it probably shouldn't have.
Yeah, but then of course that then kicks us all the way back to really simple models and kind of, you know, thinking about the problem from different angles, and you know, and you'll never get rid of the, you know, the proverbial black swan, because even the group of experts could be blindsided by something that they just hadn't anticipated.
Absolutely.
I mean, one thing I don't understand is why that doesn't fit into the estimation paper, though, in the sense that it's going to deal with uncertainty and it's going to deal with model selection and sort of, you know, different models.
Yes, I guess I'm sort of partially pitching that it would naturally kind of fit in there, I guess, if we were given that kind of remit. But
yeah.
Previous discussions have been a little bit more constrained as to what the estimation paper would do.
Right. Okay.
That's what people want to do. I'm very happy with that. But then I would argue strongly that this stuff should go elsewhere in some overarching.
The other thing I was going to say when you started this was that maybe not my place to say it, but this morning Jasmina and Mike Cates were talking about an issue in Philosophical Transactions A, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dennis and Valerie, but
I didn't pick up where it was.
Yeah,
but
it was one of the Royal Society journals, but I didn't.
Yeah.
So I would have thought it would have been in B rather than A, but
right, maybe. But Mike Cates sort of comment about that was that was kind of maybe there was a previous special issue or one that's featuring mainly SPI-M papers, and then this was going to be one that was kind of going to cast the net wider in terms of the community. And one of the things he was saying is that he was anticipating that might be more about the philosophy of modeling and how, what we should be doing. So what struck me was that what you're describing there for the sort of, the sort of uncertainty quantification manifesto is, seems to fit within what they were discussing there, but I've got no other details. I think some more details will be coming soon.
The other things that were suggested to go in there, I thought that's a bit of a disconnect, really.
Okay.
I think it's more our territory. If other people want to, if other people want to deal with it, fine. But I really think it's so much part of the future challenges thing. I think we really should be
Okay.
saying what we want to say here, and I think I think part of it should be said in the estimation bit and part in the policy bit, and also I guess the whole thing is going to have a preface, and the preface will be a good place to try and make some overarching comments.
Yes, I was going to say exactly the same. I mean, we imagine that each paper will have an introduction and possibly a discussion, so some points can be made there, but presumably the collection as a whole will have some introductory material. But also, going back to a comment Ian made, that I think the remit is what we want it to be. So it's as wide as we choose it to be. There isn't a sort of prescribed remit, and whether things fit or don't fit. If we want it to fit, it fits. So.
This is good. Well, yes, I totally agree. I mean, the estimation paper, if there is consensus, I mean, that should cover all the stuff, the estimation tasks within the whole kind of pipeline too, of course. But if there is consensus, we could have a chunk of that paper to just discuss this kind of broader issue, the kind of embedding models within this framework. And then the other papers, should they feel the need to, can always refer to this bit. They can always cite this bit and say, of course, there are these further issues about, the model uncertainty and whatnot. Refer to this if you want a little bit more, and then we could maybe have a sentence or two at the sort of start or whatever introductions to just alert the reader to it. That would be a nice way to just flag it. I feel if we missed it out entirely, that would be a mistake. But having a bit in the estimation paper might be nice. Again, if there's consensus. As I say, this is no extra work because me and Peter will be very happy to do that bit, I'm sure. So, as I'm sure you can tell.
That sounds good. I think that sounds very good. So,
Cool. You don't want people saying we've got to have this bit in the paper, but not offering to write it at the same time.
well,
that's not helpful.
And people are not going to be allowed to get away with that.
Exactly. Cool. Okay. Well, listen. When
Yeah,
Danny
probably also value. I think we'd also value your inputs on the last section of the modelling paper as well. I think these themes would things we might want to draw out there as well, even though it might just be referring across to.
Well, it would be very nice to link these up in a nice way, wouldn't it? To maybe have a chat there just to show the modelling in the broader context or something, whatever the modelling group felt comfortable with, and then linking it onto this bit. That would be nice actually, because we could comment it from the direct modelling angle, and then in the estimation paper it'd be the slightly more stepping back and looking at the full framework and maybe mentioning multiple.
This can either be a challenge or it can be a discussion section at the end of a challenges paper. And I think, just guessing, it might be more a thing for discussion at the end of the modelling paper, but maybe pointing forward to something which is called a challenge within the estimation paper.
That could work. Definitely, there should be a place where we go into a little detail, because there's a lot of stuff already kind of worked out on this front. So there's a sort of place where we want to introduce the kind of what has been discovered so far in terms of this methodology, and there's lots of interesting kind of holes and gaps. So so maybe in the estimation paper we have a chunk which sort of says this is a structure which would work. This is how one would make it even better, but that's not been done yet. That's an open challenge. And then in the modeling paper, it can be a discussion of course, these models need to be used carefully, and there's all sorts of things you can do. For example, reading the estimation paper. Yeah. So something along that line.
Yeah. Sounds like that might work.
When's the next modelling discussion group? I'm sorry, I my time is so precious these days.
The next one will be the same time next week, i.e.
Friday morning at 10.
Friday morning at 10, yes. One of the things that Dennis and I were just saying at the beginning of this, before most of you had joined, was that I think we need to send round something to everybody, or at least all these sort of active challenge people, just saying, you know, where everything's got to in terms of papers in boxes and times of next meetings and so on, so that people can, because we fix one meeting dependent on who's come to the previous one to some extent. So you know, for the next one of these, we might say, oh well, when works for you six, and by that mechanism, you tend to sort of lose people along the way. So I think we need to sort of get everybody back together a little bit, but we'll try and do
you
that.
two have been doing an amazing job herding all these cats. I mean, you've been herding cats for 6 months now. I mean,
and referring to and thinking of this, updating everyone, it would be nice to point them at the two cross tabulations.
Yeah, well, at everything, at all the sort of current state.
And on that, I would like to reiterate that I think the first challenges 1 to 5, what I'm calling the applications, seems fairly well sort of structured now. The methodologies one, pretty much less so. I mean, I've taken the bullet points that have come up in the discussions and I've tried to put them into the table, but I'd welcome some thinking about whether some of the holes there should be filled and whether there are key points that should be put there. And the two ways you can do that, if you want to do a substantial change or addition, just save it with your initials and the date at the end. If you've just got a few suggestions for things to put in or comments like that, just email me and I'll maybe make them, bearing in mind what other people say, put them into there. But it would be nice to get that filled out over the next, by early next week, so that we could have a slightly better version of that to send round everyone with the kind of prompt that Valerie is mentioning.
Right. So all that being said, and we've already said that there's another estimation thing next Thursday at 5, which various people can't manage, but some can. So what do you think is the best way forward on this? To fix another meeting next week, by which time we will hopefully have Danny's list, so that there should be something a bit more to discuss.
I can make next week at 5. That was for Danny, wasn't it? Because she was free.
Yes.
Then.
Yes.
Peter, are you still block booked Thursday afternoons?
I'm teaching.
I gather so.
Say again, you're teaching?
I'm teaching until 6:30.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is that every day or only Thursday?
No, it's only Thursday. It's only Thursday.
Yeah, I mean, I you know, we talked about Thursday because the last meeting was on a Thursday, but it's possible that Danny could move. We could move to another day at 5 that might work for her and work for equally well for other people.
We have a subsequent, Valerie, I think, given the number of people who signed up to that, we probably shouldn't change next week.
I think you're right. But we might
have the same discussion then for the week after. Let's see if we could, you know, ask for Wednesday instead, say, or Saturday.
And Glenn, are you good for Thursday next week? Is that okay for you? Thursday at 5, is that?
So you're on mute, Glenn.
I've got a meeting 4 till 6, but I was kind of hoping I might be able to skip out by 5, so I'll try and join.
Get back to it, man. I don't know what it is, but it won't be as good.
It's a management group meeting, so.
What is it? Sorry.
It's a management group meeting, so.
Oh, you definitely miss that.
I should definitely try and miss it. Yeah.
I was going to say point proven. I think. I mean.
We've gone for more than an hour.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Good.
Okay. Well, so the best thing is.
Sounds as though Peter's drawn the short straw there, but we'll try and make sure that you know, if you have any comments
Yeah, I'll have a look. I'll have a look during the week and see if the thing comes out. I'll send some comments in.
Yeah,
That would be the best thing, Peter. I think stage plan for next week is getting this structure in place. So Danny's going to write something. We all have a look at it and then just add bits, add some discussions,
Yeah.
see if we can get to something we're roughly happy with.
Yeah,
And
and
that would
see
be
if
a
we
very
can,
good goal for the end of next week.
yeah, see if we can all fit our, our clothes in the suitcase or whatever they,
Our pet project.
stuffing. Everyone trying to stuff in slightly more than their fair share. Into it's a sort of image that comes to mind.
All sitting on the suitcase and try and get it in. I like that.
That's it. Sort of medium-sized suitcase as well, not even that big. Sort of.
Okay.
Good. All right.
Good.
That's
Okay.
great. So
Okay.
I'm going to, I think I'm going to stop recording now. So